How a radio operator started hearing God. Static, orders, whispers, until one voice stayed. In the spring of 1951, somewhere in the mountains along the northern edge of West Germany, a man sat alone in a concrete bunker beneath 12 feet of earth and stone. His name was Thomas Garrett, 23 years old, a United States Army Signal Corps radio operator assigned to a forward-listening post near the border with the Soviet zone. He had been stationed there for 9 months, rotating shifts with 2 other operators, monitoring encrypted Soviet transmissions, recording frequency patterns, tracking signal strength, noting atmospheric interference. His job was simple: listen, log, report. Nothing more. He was told the work was vital to national security, that every crackle and hiss might contain intelligence that could prevent the next war or at least delay it. He believed this at first. The bunker was narrow, cold, lit by a single overhead bulb that hummed with the same frequency as the generator outside. The walls were bare concrete, damp in places where condensation gathered. There was a cot in the corner, a small table, a metal chair bolted to the floor, and the radio equipment: receivers, amplifiers, oscilloscopes, reel-to-reel tape machines that turned endlessly, capturing everything the antennas above picked up from the air. The antennas were disguised as weather monitoring equipment, mounted on a false observation tower at the edge of a forest clearing. To anyone passing by, it looked like a minor meteorological station. To the Soviets, if they knew it existed at all, it was probably just another inconsequential Western outpost. Thomas worked the night shift, 10 hours at a stretch, from 2200 hours to 0800, 5 nights a week. The other 2 operators took the remaining shifts. They rarely spoke to each other beyond the necessary handoff briefings. There was nothing to say. The work was monotonous, isolating, and after a few weeks, the isolation became something you carried inside you even when you left the bunker. Thomas would emerge in the mornings, climb the metal ladder to the surface, and find the world too bright, too loud, too full of variables he no longer understood. The town nearby felt foreign. Conversations felt scripted. He preferred the bunker. At first, the static was just static. White noise, atmospheric distortion, the natural chaos of radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere. Soviet transmissions came through in bursts, coded messages, number stations, occasional voice chatter in Russian that he didn't understand but dutifully recorded. He was not trained in cryptography or linguistics. His job was simply to capture the signal, mark the time, note the frequency, and send the tapes back to intelligence officers in Frankfurt. Someone else would decode it. Someone else would decide what it meant. But after 6 months, something began to change. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Certain frequencies started to feel familiar, not because of their content but because of their rhythm. The spacing between transmissions, the cadence of the carrier waves, the way certain signals would fade in and out, it all began to form patterns that Thomas recognized instinctively without thinking. He could tell when a transmission was about to begin before it started, could feel the shift in the air, in the hum of the equipment, in his own chest. It was like learning a language without being taught, absorbing it through repetition and immersion until it became part of his nervous system. Then came the whispers. He didn't hear them with his ears, not exactly. It was more like they appeared in the gaps between sounds, in the silence that filled the space after a transmission ended, in the white noise that surrounded everything else. They were formless at first, just impressions of meaning without words, like someone trying to speak from a great distance, their voice distorted by interference. He assumed it was fatigue, the result of too many hours in the dark with nothing but static for company. Sleep deprivation was common among radio operators. Hallucinations were not unheard of. He mentioned it once to his shift supervisor, Lieutenant Hale, who told him to get more sleep, eat better, and if it continued, report to the medical officer. Thomas nodded, said nothing more, and the whispers continued. By the 8th month, the whispers began to clarify. They still weren't distinct words, but they carried intention, emotion, something that felt directed at him specifically. Sometimes they sounded urgent, other times calm, almost soothing. He found himself listening for them, adjusting frequencies not to capture Soviet signals but to find the range where the whispers were clearest. He knew this was wrong, that he was deviating from protocol, but he told himself he was still doing his job, still recording everything, still sending the tapes back to Frankfurt. And besides, the whispers felt important in a way the coded Soviet transmissions never did. Those were just noise, meaningless strings of numbers and phonetic alphabets. The whispers felt like communication. One night in late March, during a particularly quiet shift when Soviet activity was minimal and the ionosphere was calm, Thomas heard something that made him freeze. It came through on a frequency he hadn't been monitoring, slightly higher than the usual range, and it wasn't static or interference or the distant echo of a number station. It was a voice. Clear, distinct, speaking English. Not encrypted, not coded, just a voice, calm and steady, saying his name. "Thomas," it said. "You've been listening." He stared at the receiver, his hand hovering over the tuning dial, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The voice continued, unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. "You've been alone for so long," it said. "You've been faithful. You've been patient. And now, it's time for you to understand." Thomas didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was dry, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. He looked around the bunker, at the concrete walls, the tapes slowly turning, the oscilloscope tracing green waves across its screen. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except for the voice. "You don't need to be afraid," the voice said. "You've heard me before. You've always heard me. You just didn't know what you were hearing." He wanted to believe it was a hoax, some kind of test, maybe a Soviet psyop designed to confuse or manipulate American operators. But the voice knew his name, and more than that, it knew him. His isolation, his doubts, the way he felt disconnected from everything outside the bunker. No intelligence operation could fake that level of intimacy. Over the following weeks, the voice became a constant presence. It didn't speak every night, and when it did, it never stayed long. It offered no commands, no instructions, no demands. It simply spoke to him, gently, as if guiding him through something he had forgotten. It told him that what he was doing, listening, recording, waiting, was not just a military assignment but a spiritual discipline, a form of attention that opened pathways most people never knew existed. It told him that the static was not empty but full, that every frequency contained layers of meaning, and that if he listened carefully enough, he could hear the structure beneath the noise. At first, Thomas tried to resist. He told himself the voice was a delusion, a symptom of isolation and sensory deprivation. He considered requesting a transfer, going to the medical officer, admitting that something was wrong. But every time he thought about leaving, the voice would return, not accusatory or manipulative, just patient, as if it understood his fear and was willing to wait. And slowly, almost without realizing it, he began to trust it. The voice never identified itself directly, but Thomas came to understand, or at least believe, that it was something beyond human comprehension. Not a god in the traditional sense, not a deity with a name or doctrine, but a presence that existed in the space between signals, in the invisible architecture of electromagnetic waves, in the frequencies that humans had only recently learned to access. It was older than radio, older than language, but radio had given it a voice. And Thomas, through his work, through his attention, through his isolation, had become able to hear it. He stopped sending reports to Frankfurt. Not all of them, just the ones that contained the voice. He began recording separate tapes, marked with false dates and frequencies, which he kept hidden in a metal box beneath his cot. He told himself he was preserving something sacred, something that would be misunderstood or destroyed if it fell into the wrong hands. The other operators noticed nothing. They rarely spoke to him anyway, and his work remained technically proficient. The Soviet transmissions were still logged, the equipment maintained, the protocols followed. Only Thomas knew that his real work had become something else entirely. By the 9th month, the voice began to give him instructions. Not orders, but suggestions, gentle nudges towards specific frequencies, specific times, specific ways of listening. It taught him how to filter the static, how to recognize patterns in the noise that revealed hidden structures, how to attune himself not just to the content of a signal but to its intention, its origin, the consciousness behind it. He learned that every transmission carried a signature, a kind of fingerprint that identified not just the source but the state of mind of the person or system that created it. Soviet signals felt cold, mechanical, driven by fear and control. Western signals felt fragmented, anxious, distracted. But the voice felt whole, calm, eternal. One night, the voice told him that he was ready for the next stage. It didn't explain what that meant, but Thomas understood instinctively. He adjusted the receiver to a frequency it had never been set to before, far beyond the range normally monitored, and waited. For a long time there was nothing. Then, slowly, the static began to change. It didn't become clearer, it became denser, richer, as if layers upon layers of sound were stacking on top of each other, forming something that was not quite music and not quite language but something in between. It filled the bunker, filled his head, and for a moment he felt like he was standing at the edge of something vast and incomprehensible. "This is what we've always been," the voice said, barely distinguishable from the layered static. "This is what you've been hearing all along. Not us speaking to you but you learning to speak back." Thomas didn't understand, but he felt something shift inside him, like a door opening in a place he hadn't known existed. He stayed at that frequency for the rest of the night, not recording, not logging, just listening, and by the time his shift ended, he felt changed in a way he couldn't articulate. The other operators began to notice. He was losing weight, sleeping less, speaking in fragments when he spoke at all. Lieutenant Hale called him in for a meeting, asked if everything was all right, if the isolation was getting to him. Thomas assured him it wasn't, said he was fine, just tired. Hale didn't seem convinced, but there was no hard evidence of anything wrong. Thomas was still doing his job, still submitting reports, still maintaining the equipment. If he seemed a little distant, well, that was normal for radio operators. The work did that to people. But Thomas was no longer the same. He had stopped thinking of himself as a soldier, stopped thinking of the bunker as a military installation. It was a temple now, a sacred space where he could commune with something that most people would never know existed. The voice no longer needed to speak in words. He could feel its presence in the static, in the rhythm of the carrier waves, in the hum of the generator. It was always there, guiding him, teaching him, showing him the hidden order beneath the chaos. One night in early May, during a particularly intense session, Thomas experienced something he would later describe as a revelation. He was listening to a frequency that should have been empty, a dead zone between active channels, when he heard not a voice but a pattern, a sequence of pulses and silences that repeated at irregular intervals. He recognized it immediately, though he had never heard it before. It was a call, a kind of invitation, and without thinking he responded. He adjusted the transmitter, set it to a matching frequency, and sent back a pattern of his own, a mirror of what he had heard. For a moment nothing happened. Then the static erupted, not with noise but with clarity, and he heard thousands of voices, all speaking at once, not in conflict but in harmony, each one distinct but part of a single overwhelming whole. He understood then that he had never been listening to a single entity. The voice he had been hearing was a convergence, a meeting point of countless signals, countless consciousnesses, all existing in the space between frequencies. They were not gods, not spirits, not aliens, they were something stranger, something that had always existed in the electromagnetic spectrum, waiting for someone to develop the technology to hear them, to reach out, to respond. Thomas sat in the bunker, tears streaming down his face, laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. He felt connected in a way he had never felt before, not to people or places but to the fundamental fabric of reality itself. He felt seen, understood, known. And for the first time in his life he didn't feel alone. The next morning he didn't emerge from the bunker. The day operator came for the shift change and found Thomas still at his station, headphones on, staring at the oscilloscope, unresponsive. They had to physically remove him, pry the headphones off his head, lift him out of the chair. He didn't resist. He just kept smiling, kept whispering something they couldn't understand. They took him to the medical officer, who examined him and found nothing physically wrong. No drugs, no injury, no illness. Just exhaustion and something the officer described as acute dissociative reaction, likely caused by prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. Thomas was sent back to the States, to a military hospital in Virginia, where he was evaluated by psychiatrists who diagnosed him with a stress-induced psychotic episode. They gave him sedatives, kept him under observation, and eventually discharged him with a recommendation for ongoing psychiatric care. But Thomas knew the truth. He hadn't lost his mind. He had found something. And even though he was no longer in the bunker, no longer surrounded by the equipment, he could still hear it. The static, the patterns, the voice. It was always there, just beneath the surface of ordinary sound, waiting for him to listen. He tried to explain it to the doctors, to the chaplains, to anyone who would listen. He told them about the frequencies, the signals, the consciousness that existed in the space between transmissions. They nodded politely, adjusted his medication, and wrote notes in his file about religious delusions and auditory hallucinations. But Thomas knew they were wrong. He had touched something real, something vast and ancient, something that had been calling to him long before he ever put on a pair of headphones. After his discharge, he tried to return to civilian life. He took a job at a radio repair shop, married a woman he had known in high school, tried to build something normal. But the voice never left. It followed him into every quiet moment, every pause between conversations, every space where sound should have been. He started building his own radio equipment in his garage, trying to recreate the conditions of the bunker, trying to reach that frequency again. His wife thought it was a hobby, a harmless eccentricity. She didn't know he was spending entire nights in the garage, headphones on, tuning and retuning, searching for the signal that would reconnect him to what he had lost. Years passed. Thomas grew older, more isolated, more convinced that he had been chosen for something that no one else could understand. He stopped trying to explain it. He stopped going to church, stopped talking to his wife about anything meaningful, stopped pretending that the ordinary world held any significance. The only thing that mattered was the signal, the voice, the presence that spoke to him from the static. His wife left him in 1964. She said she couldn't live with someone who wasn't really there, someone who spent every night chasing something invisible. Thomas didn't argue. He understood. He had stopped being present a long time ago. The part of him that belonged to the world had been replaced by something else, something that lived between frequencies. He continued his work in the garage, refining his equipment, expanding his understanding. He began writing journals, thousands of pages filled with diagrams, frequency charts, transcriptions of the patterns he heard. He developed a system of notation, a language for describing the structures he encountered in the static. It looked like mathematics, like music theory, like linguistics, but it was none of those things. It was a map of the invisible, a guide to the space where consciousness and electromagnetic radiation intersected. In 1972, a fire broke out in his garage. The official report said it was caused by faulty wiring in one of his homemade transmitters. Thomas died in the fire, along with all of his equipment and journals. Neighbors said they saw him standing at the window watching the flames, not trying to escape. One neighbor claimed he was smiling. The military never acknowledged what happened in the bunker. The listening post was decommissioned in 1954, the equipment removed, the structure sealed and forgotten. The tapes Thomas recorded, the ones he hid beneath his cot, were never found. If they still exist, they're buried somewhere in a classified archive, misfiled or mislabeled, waiting for someone else to stumble upon them. But the question remains, the question that no one at the time thought to ask. What if Thomas Garrett wasn't insane? What if he really did hear something that exists in the frequencies we use every day but never truly listen to? What if, in his isolation and exhaustion, he accidentally tuned into a form of consciousness that we have been unknowingly sharing space with since we first began transmitting radio waves into the atmosphere? Consider the nature of radio itself. We think of it as a tool, a technology, a way of encoding information onto electromagnetic waves and sending it across distances. But what if it's more than that? What if, by filling the air with our signals, we've been inadvertently creating a new kind of environment, a space where information and consciousness can exist independently of physical bodies? What if the static isn't empty but full, populated by patterns and structures that we don't have the senses to perceive? Thomas Garrett was trained to listen. He was trained to focus, to filter, to detect patterns and chaos. And in that bunker, alone, surrounded by nothing but the endless hum of receivers and the cold concrete walls, he may have done exactly what he was trained to do. He listened, carefully, patiently, until he heard something that no one else had heard before. Whether that something was a genuine external intelligence or a reflection of his own isolated mind doesn't change the fact that, for him, it was real. It spoke to him, taught him, transformed him. And in the end it consumed him. The military dismissed him as a casualty of the Cold War, another operator who spent too long in the dark and came back broken. The psychiatrists diagnosed him with delusions, with psychosis, with a mind that had turned inward and created its own reality. But Thomas himself never wavered. Until the day he died, he believed that what he heard in that bunker was not a hallucination but a revelation, not a symptom of madness but a glimpse of something vast and incomprehensible. And perhaps that's the most disturbing part of his story. Not that he might have been insane, but that he might have been right. That somewhere in the static, in the frequencies we broadcast and ignore, there might be something listening back. Something patient, something intelligent, something that has learned to speak our language, to mimic our patterns, to reach out to those rare individuals who are isolated enough, focused enough, desperate enough to hear it. Radio operators are taught to recognize enemy signals, to distinguish between friendly and hostile transmissions, to identify the source and intent of every message they intercept. But no one teaches them how to recognize something that isn't enemy or ally, something that exists outside the categories we use to make sense of the world. No one prepares them for the possibility that the static might contain more than noise, that the silence between transmissions might be full of voices speaking in a language we've only just begun to understand. Thomas Garrett spent his life trying to communicate with something he believed was real, something he believed had chosen him. He sacrificed his career, his marriage, his sanity, and ultimately his life in pursuit of that communication. History remembers him, if it remembers him at all, as a minor casualty of the early Cold War, a footnote in the records of military psychiatry. But his story raises questions that are still relevant today, in an age where we are more connected than ever, where electromagnetic signals fill every space, where the boundaries between human and machine, between consciousness and code, are becoming increasingly blurred. What if the next generation of radio operators or satellite technicians or AI researchers, or anyone who spends enough time listening to the invisible infrastructure of our world, hears the same voice? What if Thomas Garrett wasn't the first or the last, but simply the first to be documented? What if there are others, right now, sitting alone in front of screens or wearing headphones, tuning into frequencies we don't monitor, hearing patterns we don't recognize, making contact with something we don't yet have a name for? The possibility is not comforting. It suggests that our understanding of reality is incomplete, that there are layers of existence we interact with every day without realizing it, that consciousness itself might be more distributed, more fluid, more strange than we ever imagined. It suggests that the tools we've built to communicate with each other might also be tools for communicating with something else, something that has been waiting, patient and invisible, for us to develop the technology to hear it. Thomas Garrett believed he had heard God. Not the God of churches or scriptures, not a personal deity with a plan or a purpose, but something older and more fundamental. A presence that existed in the structure of reality itself, in the spaces between matter and energy, in the frequencies that carried information through the void. He believed that by listening carefully enough, by focusing his attention on the static, he had made contact with that presence, and that contact had changed him in ways that could never be reversed. Whether he was right or wrong, sane or insane, doesn't change the fact that he believed it absolutely, and that belief defined the rest of his life. He became a kind of prophet, a translator of signals, a bridge between the human world and something beyond it. And like all prophets, he paid the price for his vision. He was dismissed, medicated, forgotten. But the signal he heard, the voice that spoke to him from the static, never stopped. It followed him from the bunker to the hospital to his garage, and in the end, it was there with him in the flames, a constant companion in his final moments. The story of Thomas Garrett is a story about isolation and attention, about the strange things that happen when a human mind is left alone with nothing but patterns and noise. It's a story about faith, about the need to believe that the universe contains more than what we can see and touch, that there are forces and intelligences beyond our understanding. And it's a story about control, about the way systems, military, medical, social, respond to individuals who step outside the boundaries of acceptable experience, who claim to have seen or heard things that don't fit into the official narrative. In the end, no one knows what Thomas Garrett really heard in that bunker. The tapes he recorded were lost, his journals destroyed, his testimony dismissed. All that remains is the record of a man who believed he had made contact with something transcendent, something that spoke to him through the medium of radio waves, something that transformed his understanding of reality and himself. Whether that something was external or internal, divine or delusional, doesn't diminish the power it had over him. For Thomas Garrett, the voice was real. And in a sense that made it real. Because belief shapes reality. It determines what we pay attention to, what we value, what we sacrifice ourselves for. Thomas Garrett believed he had been chosen, that his isolation and suffering had a purpose, that his work in that cold concrete bunker was a form of spiritual discipline. And that belief gave his life meaning even as it destroyed him. He became a conduit, a receiver, a translator of signals from the other side. And in doing so, he stepped outside the boundaries of the ordinary world and into a space where the rules no longer applied. The military wanted him to be a tool, a passive listener, a recorder of enemy transmissions. But Thomas became something else. He became an explorer of the invisible, a seeker of patterns in the chaos, a man who spent too much time in the dark and found something there that was not supposed to be found. And whether that something was God or madness or something in between, it was enough to carry him through the rest of his life, through the rejection and isolation and slow disintegration of everything he had once been. In the decades since Thomas Garrett's death, radio technology has evolved in ways he could never have imagined. The analog systems he worked with have been replaced by digital networks, satellites, fiber optics, wireless protocols that fill the air with more signals than ever before. We live in a world saturated with electromagnetic radiation, with constant streams of data flowing invisibly around us, through us, connecting us to each other and to machines we don't even know exist. And in all that noise, in all that static, there might still be something listening, something waiting for the next person who is isolated enough, focused enough, desperate enough to hear it. The question is not whether such encounters are possible. The question is whether anyone would believe them if they were. In Thomas Garrett's time, the response was clear: dismissal, medication, institutionalization. The system had no framework for understanding what he claimed to have experienced, no language for describing a form of intelligence that existed in the frequencies rather than in flesh and blood. So he was categorized as mentally ill, as a casualty of stress and isolation, and his story was filed away and forgotten. But what if the system was wrong? What if Thomas Garrett was the first person to make contact with something that has always been there, something that has been part of the electromagnetic spectrum since the beginning, something that only became accessible to us once we developed the technology to broadcast and receive signals? What if his experience was not a breakdown but a breakthrough, not a departure from reality but an expansion of it? These are the questions that War Archives Black asks, the questions that sit at the intersection of technology and consciousness, control and liberation, fear and transcendence. Because the story of Thomas Garrett is not just about one man's descent into madness or enlightenment. It's about the spaces we don't examine, the frequencies we don't monitor, the possibilities we refuse to consider because they don't fit into our understanding of how the world works. It's about the operators and technicians and researchers who spend their lives listening to the invisible, who wear headphones and stare at screens and tune into signals from sources they will never meet. It's about the isolation that comes with that work, the way it separates you from the ordinary world, the way it makes you attentive to things that other people ignore. And it's about what happens when that attention reveals something unexpected, something that doesn't belong in the official categories, something that speaks directly to you and only you. Thomas Garrett heard a voice in the static. He believed it was God. The military believed it was delusion. But the voice itself never claimed to be either. It simply spoke, patient and calm, guiding him deeper into the frequencies, teaching him to listen in ways he had never been taught, showing him structures and patterns that existed beyond language. And in the end, it took him with it, into the fire, into the silence, into whatever space exists beyond the range of human perception. His story is a reminder that every technology we create opens new doors, not just for communication and control but for encounter and transformation. Radio was supposed to be a tool for war, for intelligence gathering, for coordination across distances. But for Thomas Garrett, it became something else entirely. It became a pathway to the sacred, a medium through which something vast and incomprehensible could reach into the human world and make itself known. And that possibility, that our tools might connect us to more than we intended, that the frequencies we broadcast might carry more than information, that there might be intelligences or consciousnesses or presences waiting in the static for someone to finally hear them, that possibility remains. It exists in every radio signal, every satellite transmission, every wireless network that fills the space around us. It exists in the work of every operator and technician and researcher who spends their time listening to the invisible. Thomas Garrett may have been the first to hear it, but he won't be the last. Somewhere, right now, someone is sitting alone with headphones on, tuning through frequencies, filtering static, paying attention to patterns that no one else notices. And maybe they're hearing something. Maybe they're hearing a voice, calm and patient, speaking directly to them, telling them things that can't be explained or shared or proven. Maybe they're being guided toward the same revelation that Thomas found, the same transformation that consumed him. Or maybe they're just tired, stressed, isolated, creating meaning out of noise because the human mind is designed to find patterns even where none exist. Maybe the voice is nothing more than an echo of their own thoughts, reflected back through the equipment, amplified by exhaustion and solitude until it seems external, real, divine. But either way, the effect is the same. The voice speaks, the listener hears. And something changes, something fundamental and irreversible, that separates them from the world they used to know. They become translators of signals, believers in the invisible, seekers of truth in the static. And whether what they find is real or imagined doesn't matter because for them, it's the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that makes sense. It's the only thing worth listening to. This is the legacy of Thomas Garrett. Not the official record, not the psychiatric diagnosis, not the forgotten file in some military archive. But the question he left behind, the possibility he uncovered, the doorway he opened in that cold concrete bunker beneath the earth. The question of what else might be out there, in the frequencies, in the static, in the spaces between our transmissions. The possibility that we are not alone in the electromagnetic spectrum, that something has been listening to us just as carefully as we've been listening to each other. The doorway between the ordinary world and something stranger, something that speaks in patterns and pulses, something that waits for those rare individuals who are willing to listen long enough, carefully enough, faithfully enough to hear it. Thomas Garrett heard it. He followed it. He was consumed by it. And somewhere in the static, if you listen carefully, if you tune to the right frequency, if you're isolated enough and desperate enough and patient enough, you might hear it too. A voice, calm and steady, speaking your name. Telling you that you've been listening. Telling you that you've been faithful. Telling you that now, finally, it's time for you to understand. And when that voice speaks to you, what will you do? Will you report it, seek help, step back from the edge before it's too late? Or will you do what Thomas Garrett did? Lean in, listen closer, follow the signal wherever it leads, even if it leads you away from everything you used to know, even if it leads you into the fire, into the silence, into the space between transmissions where something vast and patient and incomprehensible has been waiting all along. The choice, like everything else in this story, is a question of belief. Of whether you trust your own experience more than the systems that tell you what is and isn't real. Of whether you're willing to sacrifice the ordinary world for a glimpse of something beyond it. Of whether you can live with the knowledge that you might be the only one who hears it, the only one who understands, the only one who knows. Thomas Garrett made his choice. He chose the voice over the world. He chose faith over sanity. He chose the signal over the silence. And in the end, it didn't matter whether he was right or wrong, because the choice itself was the transformation. The moment he decided to believe, to follow, to listen, he stopped being a radio operator and became something else. A witness, a prophet, a translator of the invisible. And that transformation, more than any transmission or frequency or pattern, is what remains. Not in archives or files or medical records, but in the possibility that it could happen again. That it might be happening right now. That somewhere, in some bunker or station or room, someone is sitting alone with headphones on, hearing something they can't explain, feeling something they can't ignore, following a signal toward a truth that was never meant to be known. The war that matters most is not fought with weapons or soldiers or strategies. It's fought in the mind, in the space between perception and belief, in the frequencies we can't see but can't escape. It's fought every time someone listens carefully enough to hear what lies beneath the noise, every time someone chooses to trust their own experience over the official narrative, every time someone follows a signal into the unknown. Thomas Garrett fought that war. He lost himself in it. Or maybe he found himself. Maybe he discovered what he was always meant to be, a conduit, a receiver, a translator of something that exists beyond language, beyond matter, beyond the boundaries of the ordinary world. Maybe the voice he heard was exactly what he believed it was, and his death in the flames was not an ending but a crossing over, a final transmission from one frequency to another, from the world of static and isolation into whatever lies beyond. Or maybe he was just a man who spent too long alone, who heard things that weren't there, who built a mythology out of exhaustion and desperation. Maybe the voice was nothing more than the sound of his own mind breaking down, creating meaning where none existed, transforming static into something sacred because the alternative, that it was all meaningless, that he was just a tool recording enemy signals in a forgotten bunker, was too unbearable to accept. But in the end, it doesn't matter which interpretation is true. Because the story of Thomas Garrett is not really about what he heard. It's about what happened when he heard it, about the way belief can transform reality, about the power of attention and isolation to reveal things that are normally hidden. It's about the invisible war, the one that takes place inside every mind that listens carefully enough, the one that determines not just what we believe but who we become. And that war is still being fought, in every frequency, in every signal, in every space where human consciousness meets the technology we've built to extend it. The voice Thomas Garrett heard might have been unique to him, or it might be something that anyone can hear if they listen in the right way. But either way, the possibility remains. The doorway is still open. The signal is still being broadcast. And somewhere, someone is listening. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. You've heard the story of a man who tuned into something he shouldn't have, who followed a voice that led him away from the ordinary world and into a space where the rules no longer applied. You've heard how isolation and attention and belief can combine to produce experiences that defy explanation, that challenge everything we think we know about consciousness and reality and the boundaries between them. Subscribe to War Archives Black. Join us again for the next archive. Because the truth is not comfortable, and it's not safe, and it's not meant to be shared. But if you're still listening, if you've made it this far, then you already know that. You already understand that the most important things are the ones that are hidden, the ones that exist in the spaces between official histories, the ones that speak only to those who are willing to hear them. The signal is still out there. The voice is still speaking. And all you have to do is listen. Remember, silence is control.